Our featured interview this morning is with a fellow broadcaster. He is Guy Benson. He is a Fox News contributor, political editor of townhall.com, and he's the host of the nationally syndicated Guy Benson Show on Fox News Radio. He is also on the roster of the 25 top millennial broadcasters in America, News and Politics. He's a guy whose voice is heard regularly around the country right now and is becoming a real dent in politics in a very positive way. Let's welcome to the stage this morning, Guy Benson. Is a lady who has been around this business for a while. She is Rose Tennent. She's a radio host, political pundit, author, and speaker. She is host of the Rose Unplugged podcast. Rose has been syndicated on radio and television for the past 20 years. And she has also started a brand new ministry right now called She Is Called by Him. She will be the interviewer today for Guy Benson, the interviewee. Let's welcome to the stage Rose Tennent.
Thank you. So can we give Guy another warm welcome to Pennsylvania? Aren't we so happy to have him here? We really are. Before we get started, I have to ask you if you would grade Biden's administration. And I don't know if we can get lower than an F-, but how would you grade it?
Grading the Biden administration overall?
Yes, overall.
Oh, I'd have to give it an A+. Yeah.
Wait a minute, what?
And the only person doing a better job than the president is the vice president. And the only person doing a better job than the vice president is the press secretary. They're just, they're fabulous. So, have I used up all of my April Fool's jokes yet?
Yes, okay, wow.
I promise no more.
Recently, we've seen an uptick in the cancel culture, and it just seems like everybody's offended by everything anymore. And there was a recent story about Clarice Trump, who was going to speak at Trinity University, and they asked her to get liability insurance, Guy, because they said that she was risking a disruption at the university. Now, I know you've had your own experience with the cancel culture at Brown, as a matter of fact. Can you tell us about that?
So, first of all, on this trick that they play with Ms. Trump, where they say, well, you're going to cause a problem, you're going to cause a disruption, so you or the people bringing you to speak have to pay more for liability, for security. This is a way that they literally try to make speech less free, right? Because if you're an unobjectionable speaker, i.e. a left-leaning speaker, then you don't have to worry about those things.
Right.
But if you are slightly to the right of even like an average congressional Democrat, you're provocative, and therefore they find ways to try to charge you in these groups more, which I think is like obviously unfair, and there have actually been lawsuits and litigation about that, and I think there should be. That's a space to fight if they're trying to make speech less free, literally. My experience in this, and I've had a few protests here or there, and it comes with the territory to some extent. But the craziest one was at Brown University in the Ivy League. They are known as maybe the craziest of the Ivy League schools, which is a real accomplishment. And I was invited there a couple of years ago. It was right before COVID, if I recall correctly. And I guess some left-wing group on campus got word that I was coming. And so they put together this petition and this basically a manifesto against me and all my many crimes. One of my crimes was that I'm a white supremacist, they said, because free market capitalism is white supremacy. So that's how they did that little trick, which was fun. And then also in the manifesto, my favorite part personally was they called me homophobic, which is fun because I'm gay. I was like, who wants to tell them? Like, well, you're not really gay. I'm like, I think there's only one requirement, actually. And I checked that box, so thank you very much. So we're getting ready for the event, and Brown, to their credit, the university was standing strong. They weren't canceling the event, but there was concern that this could get ugly. And so they brought me through, when I arrived in Providence, Rhode Island, they brought me to the venue on campus, and they had like 6 cops giving me a security briefing for my talk. Wow. And they had me come in, and they were like, okay, you're gonna sit over here. If things get really out of hand, your escape route is through that door, and we'll take you to an undisclosed location to finish your talk via like a live stream. I was like, you're gonna whisk me away to an undisclosed location, like I'm Dick Cheney on 9/11. Like, it's absolutely bizarre. And they said, don't worry, we also have metal detectors, and we'll be searching everyone for guns.
Did you really want to keep going with your speech after all of that?
I said, look, I'm not worried about guns. These are Ivy League students. They definitely don't have guns. Like, if anyone has a gun, it's probably me. So, and here's the thing. So all of this played out, and I was a little nervous about it, and I opened with a few self-deprecating jokes and that sort of thing. And I had heard that a number of the students who had signed this petition to get me canceled were actually there in the room. And a few of them, like 4 of them, got up when I started to speak and did a very dramatic walkout where they live streamed it on their phones. And I said, oh, you're so brave. It's like Selma, good for you. And they sort of got laughed at. And people sort of chuckled at me making fun of them as they dramatically walked out of the room. And I said, okay, now that little tantrum's over, let's talk. And what happened was, at the end of the day, I finished my talk. There was a Q&A. The students got up, some of them who don't agree with me, and they asked tough questions. And I responded, and tough in their mind. They're like, oh, here's this conservative, I'm gonna get him. They'll ask a really tough question, like, oh, I've never heard that one before, you got me. But I responded, and we had a back and forth, and I may not have convinced them of everything, but we had this exchange. And then the Q&A, and we did a lot of Q&A, and then I finally said, look, we're out of time, but wasn't this lovely? And I'll stick around, and I'll talk to more of you if you'd like to ask me some more questions. And this is how America should work. You come, ideas are exchanged, you can challenge with polite but pointed questions, we go back and forth, and then we all go home, and the sun will rise in the east tomorrow, and we'll all be just fine. And it was sort of like, it was sort of like a bit of an aha moment for some of them. So I give credit to Brown because they didn't cave to these crazy people, and then we sort of had this constructive experience. So that was maybe a better experience than other people have had. You see some of the unhinged videos, and it is disgusting, honestly, when that sort of thing happens, where there's basically riots. But my hope, and maybe this is naive, but my hope is that there's enough of a backlash building where even I think some of the kids on campus in particular, there are the loud, aggressive, activist shouters, and then there's everyone else who are kind of scared to say anything but ultimately want to hear exchange of ideas and don't support that kind of thing. And my hope is there'll be more and more people standing up to the crazies.
No, because, how much further can we take this, really?
I don't know. I don't want to find out.
I know, I don't either.
And when you think something worse could happen, it's just like, don't give them any ideas because they'll do it.
So true. All right, so let's talk about, we've got a majority in the House right now, and they are really on the offense. And one of the things that they did was to pass legislation on ESG, and they did get bipartisan support. There were Democrats that voted along with them. Biden vetoed. So let's talk about ESG, why that's important, and then why is he out of touch? Is he tone deaf? Is he just, I don't even know what to ask you about him, but maybe we shouldn't talk too much about him, but what happened here?
Well, so a couple things on the House majority in D.C. I was curious to see what their first major bill would be, and it was H.R. 1, this big energy bill that they just passed. And it's a good bill. And almost every Republican voted for it, and they picked off a handful of Democrats as well. It's probably DOA in the Senate, but in terms of messaging, right? So I think there's a certain swing seat in this state, congressional seat, occupied by a female Democrat who pretends to be a moderate, but she isn't. She very helpfully voted no on this bill, showing her true colors yet again. She voted with the Democrats against the D.C. crime overturn bill, which is a totally insane thing in D.C. where crime is out of control. And even many of the Democrats decided that they need some adult supervision in that city. But she was among most House Democrats who voted with the D.C. City Council to basically uphold their recent bill that reduces criminal penalties for a lot of violent and serious crimes. Carjackings in D.C. have tripled in the last few years. And the D.C. City Council said, let's lower the criminal penalties for carjacking in D.C., which seems, I'm not an expert, it seems like a bad idea to me. That's my analysis. That's why I get paid the big bucks for that sort of thing. Bad idea to lower crime penalties for carjacking in D.C., but that's what they've done. But finally, Biden came out and said, oh gosh, I'm in a political corner, we need to overturn that. And he hung a bunch of his Democrats out to dry who had already voted the other direction. You mentioned the ESG vote. Very interesting. And this was a Republican bill, but it had enough bipartisan support to not just pass the House, which is, of course, held by the Republicans, but the Senate as well. So when Biden announced his veto, is his first ever veto as president on this ESG bill, and the way that he described it was just this absolute word salad of nonsense, of like buzzwords that are poll tested. He said, oh, this is the MAGA Republicans, the extreme MAGA Republicans have done this because they want to put Marjorie Taylor Greene in charge of your retirement fund. It's like, no, that's not what the bill does at all. And I think what he's counting on is for a lot of Americans to be sort of ignorant of how bills become law, right? Unaware of the Schoolhouse Rock song and that whole thing, where MAGA Republicans could not have put this bill on his desk because MAGA Republicans, or Republicans generally, don't control the upper chamber of Congress. And yet it ended up on his desk because some Democrats voted for it. But the way that they're messaging the thing is it's like, oh, it's the backbencher, weird MAGA Republicans. Obviously, they have polling or focus groups that tell them that's what they should say, although he says it about everything, and it's exhausting. But, you had a couple Senate Democrats who got on the right side of that. Not to be too cynical, but they happen to be up for re-election next year in their red states. So you might have a Joe Manchin getting nervous. You might have a John Tester getting nervous. So they have to cast a few votes for the folks back home so they can pretend that they're moderate, especially Tester. Total fraud. But at least on this one, they got it to the president's desk, and Biden's pretending that it's just a MAGA bill. So I think that's one of the things that conservatives and Republicans can use against all the other Democrats who voted no on this thing, because the reality is all the Republican bill, the bipartisan bill, did was pull back the politics of ESG. Like, get the garbage politics out of this stuff. And Biden tried to turn that on its head and pretend it was the Republicans politicizing it. Precisely the opposite was true, which is often the case with things that Joe Biden says.
That is so true. All right, so we've got a 2024 presidential election coming up, and people have been talking about it a lot. And, Pennsylvania is a very important state, of course, in the country.
I've heard,
Did
yes.
you hear that?
Yeah.
Good. So when we think about this presidential election coming up, is it crazy to have too many people that are running? I mean, should we hope for that? Should we hope for just some really good quality candidates? Or what are we looking for in a candidate this time around?
Well, I mean, that's a lot to unpack. So let's just start with this. If you look at, our new Fox News polling that just came out a couple days ago has former President Trump at the top of the heap, followed by Ron DeSantis, who's speaking here later, followed by everyone else who's in like the mid to low single digits. So if we're just talking about those top two for a moment, I think we've seen President Trump gaining steam. So he lost a fair amount of momentum after the midterm elections for a number of reasons. I think a lot of conservative voters said, okay, what just happened here? Is this the direction we want to go again? But recently, obviously, there's been a few things about the former president in the news cycle. He's getting a lot of attention. He's right in the spotlight, which is where he loves to be. And there's no such thing in his mind as bad publicity. And in this case, he's absolutely right, because you have this deranged prosecutor in New York who is famous for downgrading criminal penalties and criminal charges, who has somehow found this cockamamie scheme, like this legal bank shot, untested theory to, like maybe for the first time in history, upcharge a defendant, and it happens to be Donald Trump, on a case that was reviewed by the feds and they didn't prosecute, reviewed by the FEC, they didn't want to go there, reviewed by this office in Manhattan under his predecessor and him, and they decided not to go there. And then for some reason, they've moved forward with this case. And I mean, it's not just conservatives saying this. There's a number of left-leaning legal experts who have said this is an extremely, extremely weak case. And look, I'm old-fashioned this way. My understanding of the law, I'm not a lawyer, is prosecutors are discouraged bringing very weak cases in general against defendants, especially when it involves a brand new, novel, untested legal theory to get there, where they took, in this case, what would be a misdemeanor. And look, personally, do I believe that Donald Trump, because he said he, It's all untrue. He didn't do any of this stuff with Stormy Daniels. I'm like, I mean, you paid her 6 figures. I don't think that was out of the goodness of your heart. That might have been to actually have her not say something. But these are NDAs. These are legal. These are commonplace. What might have been illegal was the fudging of the books to sort of disguise the payments. So that would be a misdemeanor. To make it into a felony, which is what Alvin Bragg's trying to do here, is you have to attach another crime to it, which in this case would be a federal campaign violation, which the feds have already looked at and decided wasn't a crime. So my old-fashioned view is you shouldn't bring this type of case against anybody, and you especially should not bring this case as the first ever indictment of a former president of the United States. What an absolute disgrace. So for that reason, I mean, you look at every single person on the Republican side who's running for president or might run for president, and they are unanimous in defending Trump and going after Alvin Bragg. So there is a rally around the flag effect right now for Donald Trump, where I think he's going to get a huge amount of small dollar money flowing in because of this. I know there was one report that they're going to do it all behind the scenes, this arraignment next week. I still think there's a possibility that he will want to make a big show out of it. He'll want Trump-branded handcuffs that are gold. Take me away, officer. So guilty, so nasty, right? And he'll do a big perp walk, bowing to the crowd, waving to the crowd. Remember when AOC pretended to be handcuffed, right? Like that type of thing, because he'll raise more money. And I think a lot of conservatives will say, I mean, we laugh, but they'll say, what an outrage this is, honestly. How partisan, how political. This is not a way to run a proper country. And he will, I think, as we're seeing, have a lot of people instinctively rushing to his defense, and we're seeing his polls rising, I think, largely for that reason. Now, longer term, because we have very short memories and the news cycles go very fast, because remember the big news story at the very beginning of the week was the horrible atrocity in Nashville, and then the whole media has basically moved on to the Trump indictment, and that was like 3 days. So where we will be collectively and where our thought process will be as conservative voters 3 months from now, let's say in June, when a certain governor of a certain state might be announcing for president, I don't know, perhaps dynamics will change a little bit. I think what conservative voters ultimately need to think about more than anything is winning. One of the things that I sort of admire / envy about the left is that ultimately they prize winning above everything else. They fall in line because they recognize, and it's like a very elementary point that everyone in this room understands, but they in their bones understand that in order to wield power, which is what they want more than anything, they want to micromanage our lives, they want to raise our taxes, they want to do all the horrible things that they do when they're in charge. In order to attain the power, they can't do that unless they win, which is why you have a bunch of people who don't like Joe Biden and don't want to be the nominee ultimately look around and they say, okay, we've got to win, and they nominate him. And you see that not just at the presidential level, but really filtering down even in congressional votes. Like Nancy Pelosi, the squad would make a big sound and fury about things, and there'd be, rumors that maybe she didn't have the votes, but ultimately they call the vote, boom, and they pass it. They fall in line. And I'm not saying that Republicans should blindly follow that same direction. Like, we're individualists, I think we're critical thinkers, at least we should be, and we're not sort of, sheep stampeding off whatever cliff Nancy Pelosi tells us to, or whoever it might be, but there is something, it's a team sport in politics. Sticking together and prizing winning really matters. And look, 2024 election is could be very clarifying, right? You're going to have Joe Biden, he'll be like 97, I think, in 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And the thing about, and here's the thing, and look, I hope to be 80 one day. Like, I strive, I aspire to be like an old white man at some point. This is what I hope to be. But I also, if I'm 80 and that's sort of where I am, I shouldn't be making crucial decisions for 330 million people, right? So what Biden's going to tell the country, because I think he's running, right? I wasn't convinced of that, but it's looking more and more. He's starting to do a few like fake moderate moves, so I think he's running. Plus, who else do they have? Honestly, right now, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Pete. You know, so like they're stuck. They're stuck with him. They're stuck with her. Because someone was just asking me, well, can't they get her off the ticket? No, I don't think they can. How can the party obsessed with identity politics throw the first ever all the things off the ticket, no matter what a liability she is? Right? She'll just sit here prattling on about Venn diagrams and school buses, laughing at her non-jokes, and they can't do anything about it. They're stuck with her. Congratulations. Good call. But Biden's going to come to the American people and say, think about this. He will want to be president for the next 6 years. Can he physically do that? Can he be president for the next 6 years? There is a real opening, I think, for the Republican Party to say, we're back, here's our governing agenda, this isn't working, but just Joe Biden sucks isn't enough. Because Joe Biden sucks was kind of the midterm message, and under normal circumstances, that would have been enough for Republicans to win a wave, and they didn't. So the other side being bad is helpful. If we're in a recession next year, for example, that would be horrible for the country, potentially politically advantageous for Republicans, but not enough. So what Republican voters have to think about is, who is the person, who would the ticket be that would put the Republican Party in the best position to win? And that's not just who makes us feel the best. It's also listening to and looking at what independent voters are telling us about the types of Republicans that they are happy to vote for, eager to vote for, and those that they're not. And whether we like that or not, the people in the middle who decide the elections, like, we can ignore them and, in my mind, continue to potentially lose winnable elections, or we can listen to that and say, okay, how do we calibrate our expectations and what we want to do so that we can win enough of those people over, but also keep our side motivated and showing up? It's a balancing act, but it's one that I think requires the critical thinking that I was just talking about, and not just jumping on a bandwagon without considering that, because the importance of this election is too high to make a mistake.
You mentioned feeling good. And I noticed a trend of the last couple of election cycles. People were involved in sensationalism and emotional, and some people even told me, I'm voting for this person, I'm voting my heart. I don't think that that is how we should decide who we're going to vote for, who the candidate should be, who the nominee should be. So have you noticed that, just a trend towards more sensationalism, emotionalism, as people are going to the polls?
Yes. I mean,
and does that scare you? I mean, I feel like we're not going in thinking critically, as you suggested.
Well, I think for a long time, Democrats were the party that would fall in love with politicians, and Republicans were a little bit more thoughtful about things, or they would just sort of say, like, okay, who's next in line? Who's next in line? Obviously, all that's blown up now. You know, Donald Trump was not next in line to anyone, right? All of a sudden, he just came down the escalator and changed everything in 2015. So I think our politics are different. I think some of the old conventional wisdom doesn't apply anymore. I think that, look, obviously emotion matters in politics. We're gathered in a windowless room on a Saturday not because we're total weirdos, although, I mean, let's be honest, we kind of are. We're like big political nerds, but because we care. We care because the direction of Pennsylvania and the direction of America matters a lot. If not America, then who? This is why I'm happy to drive from Washington, D.C. and come up here and talk to you guys on a weekend where I actually don't have work, which is rare for me, because this stuff matters. And we all understand that. We understand that in our soul, which is why we're here. It's why we're engaged, right? So, of course, there's emotion in politics. There should be. And I also understand, politics is a popularity contest. Who do people like more? Those independents that I was talking about, amazingly, they don't necessarily have beautifully formed worldviews, where you can ask them, how do you feel about these 7 issues? And they'll give you 4 answers here and 3 answers there, and you're like, I don't understand how that fits together. But that's the reality, how a lot of people who don't follow this stuff as closely as we do, that's how they kind of go about the process. So my argument is, you have to understand that, yes, emotions, personalities, that sort of thing matter, But we, the people who are sort of in this room, the movers and shakers in key states, have to be thinking about this stuff at a much more strategic level. That's our responsibility. And there's a lot of responsibility that entails. And so it's strategic choices coming up. And, you know, your heart matters, but your head also matters a lot. Let's use both.
You know, one of the things that we saw was a disappointment, particularly here in Pennsylvania during the midterm elections. Oh, by the way, you're in D.C., right?
I'm technically on the Virginia side. I'm on the recently liberated Commonwealth of Virginia, where we have a real governor.
Yay, we're going to talk about that, in fact, yes. Well, I was just going to ask you, have you seen John Fetterman? I mean, we're all looking for him. We haven't seen
boy.
him. How did we do so poorly? And we underperformed, the GOP underperformed with suburban voters, particularly female voters.
Yeah. So let me just say this about Fetterman. Obviously, he has some very serious health issues and mental health issues, and I hope very much that he gets the help that he needs, that he can recover. He's a human being. We oppose his policies, but he's got a family, and I hope that he gets the help that obviously is necessary in this case. I am also still astonished that that man is a United States Senator. Astonished. I mean, I watched that debate. I said, okay, you know, whether you love Oz or not, he can speak full sentences. And they were hiding Fetterman and pretending that he was fine and lying to us and gaslighting us. And then on went the cameras and it was like, oh man. And then he won. So this is the other argument of the other side being bad isn't enough to win. Joe Biden and what they've done in D.C. for 2 years, horrible. Horrible. And yet they had sort of a decent midterm election, right? John Fetterman, I don't know what else to say, just like roll the tape, elected a U.S. Senate. Now, of course, he had banked, what, 500,000 votes by that point already? So that's part of the process, too. But there was another statewide race in Pennsylvania last year. And the Republican candidate lost by, 12 points? I didn't realize that was possible in a state like Pennsylvania, but he did. Look, whether you love the guy or not, the results, the voters spoke, right? So at some point, when you look to the next election, it's not like we're talking about something that happened a decade ago and memories get fuzzy or whatever. It happened a few months ago. Decisions have to be made. Okay, well, we've seen this movie. We just saw the movie. It was just in theaters. And we saw the ending of that movie. Is that something that we want to have more of or less of? And if the answer is less of it, then that means making different choices. I'm not going to parachute into a state and tell the people of that state how they ought to vote, especially in a primary. But the strategic thinking that I was talking about really does matter. And I mentioned Virginia. Let me just talk. Here's a positive story, because you've had a couple really tough ones in this state. Although, bless your hearts, I just gave a speech out in Washington State and in California. You guys have it so much better than they do. I mean, it's just like, they're like, you need to inspire us. Give us hope in our elections. I'm like, oh, I don't know what to say.
No.
I don't know what to say. I did, although when I was in California, I had just been on Gutfeld on Fox, which is such a fun show to do. If you ever watch Fox or Gutfeld, thank you. You never know. The scariest thing, like maybe in my media career, is when you're sitting there waiting for Greg Gutfeld to introduce you and you have no idea what he's going to say. Last time I believe it was, if he looked any younger, he'd be sitting on Kevin Spacey's lap. Please welcome Guy Benson. I was like, oh man, and you're on national television. How do you react to that? No. But one of the jokes was, because there was a cold snap when I was out in Southern California, and it was like actually sort of chilly, which it rarely is out there. And the joke on Gutfeld was, it's so cold in Los Angeles that Governor Newsom is urging Los Angelinos to poop indoors. And I remember I said, you know what, I'm going to use that. So I opened my speech with that joke, because I want to make sure, I want to bring highbrow humor, So let's start with a poop joke. But that's sort of the state of their politics in California and out on the left coast. You guys have a crucial role to play with a lot more hope in this state, obviously. And getting back to Virginia, the Virginia Republican Party was sort of sliding in a dangerous direction, in my opinion, for a number of years. They were getting hammered statewide. They were nominating some folks who were getting crushed by the Democrats. And Virginia had gone before our eyes from a red state to a purple state to a blue state in the span of about 15 or 20 years. And the Republican Party was not reacting well to this. They were sort of like still stuck in 2004, where they're like, no, deep down we really are a red state, and so it's the voters who are wrong. Let's just keep doing crazier things. And then Glenn Youngkin came along. He became the gubernatorial nominee. He ran a very smart campaign where he got the Trump folks on side and the moderates on side and focused on crime and education and was really, really smart about it. He had an opponent who was well-known, well-funded, made a few big mistakes in Terry McAuliffe, not Governor Blackface, that was the other Democrat. And then he had that big moment in a debate where McAuliffe said the education thing, and it was off to the races. Yeah. But he had a needle to thread, Youngkin did. And in a blue state, Biden won my state by 10 points, 10. And then Youngkin came in and won it by 3. And what he did was he got almost presidential level turnout among Republicans and then won over independents and just enough Democrats. He won by 3 points. And sometimes in a state that's trending that direction, it's that kind of candidate with that type of performance that is required to win. I don't think it's as dire here yet necessarily as it was in Virginia, but he, I think, modeled the type of Republican who can win a tough race like that. And by the way, it wasn't necessarily a flash in the pan because he has governed as a conservative. He has fought smart fights in Virginia, and a poll just came out, I think it was last week. His approval rating is plus 22 in Virginia as a conservative. So that's a winning example. And I would just make one more point here because we're almost out of time. I'm here connected with, in my affiliation with, Americans for Prosperity, and I'm very proud to be connected with them and affiliated with AFP for this reason. Because I've been working with and have known folks at AFP for my whole career at this point. And I actually am not quite as young as Greg makes fun of me for looking. So I've been around in this space for a while. And AFP has authentic investment in the grassroots, which is essential. Like, we can talk about the independents. We need to win them over, absolutely. If we don't have a motivated, active grassroots, we lose. You have to do both. And AFP is authentically invested in the grassroots. They also are principled on issues. Where they stood on big issues is the same today as it was 10 years ago, even though sometimes the political winds blow different places and Republican politics get weird. They're like, no, this is what free market principles look like, and we're sticking with them. And they do have that pragmatic side that I've been talking about as well. It's sort of a fusion, in my mind, of crucial things. The base, principled beliefs, and practicality when it comes to winning. And so that, I think, is the type of model that as conservatives, we ought to think long and hard about. Because as I opened with, joking that Joe Biden gets an A+, he doesn't for obvious reasons, but he's not necessarily a shoo-in to lose. So we have to be strategic, and we have to be smart, head and heart.
You're working with some good people at Americans for Prosperity. Thank you so much for coming out to Pennsylvania
today. It's my pleasure.
Today.
Thank you guys very, very much.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.